Welcome to Old Calm Historian, your serene sanctuary where the stories of the past gently unfold. Listen closely. The soft crackle of a warm fire blends perfectly with the calm background, creating a space that soothes your mind and eases your soul. With a gentle and comforting voice guiding you, let yourself drift through time, discovering forgotten tales and timeless memories in perfect tranquility. If this peaceful journey resonates with you, please subscribe and join our community of calm explorers. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let the gentle fire and soothing stories carry you into the past. Introduction to Medieval Life. The medieval period, stretching roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, is often romanticized in popular culture. Movies, video games, and even textbooks tend to depict knights in shining armor, grand castles, and epic battles. But life during these times was far from glamorous. The reality was brutal, harsh, and unforgiving for the average person. In this scene, we delve into the daily existence of ordinary people, the challenges they faced, and the environment that shaped medieval society. Imagine waking up in a small, dark, and drafty hut. The walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, clay, and straw. The roof might be thatched, leaking whenever it rained, and your only window could be a small opening covered with oiled parchment or cloth to keep the wind out. There's no running water, no electricity, and certainly no central heating. Winter is a particularly perilous time. With temperatures dropping well below freezing, families huddle around a tiny fire, trying to stay warm with thin blankets and layers of coarse wool clothing. Hygiene was a luxury, not a standard. People rarely bathed, partly because bathing in cold rivers or communal bathhouses was uncomfortable, and partly due to the widespread belief that water could carry disease. Clothes were worn until they fell apart, and lice infestations were common. Imagine the constant itch and the smell, the filth mixed with sweat and smoke from the cooking fire. Sanitation was primitive at best. Waste was often disposed of in open pits or simply thrown into the streets. In crowded towns, this led to pervasive foul smells and the spread of disease. Diet in medieval times was another daily struggle. The majority of people were peasants, working long hours in the fields to grow enough food to survive. Meals were simple and repetitive: coarse bread, porridge made from barley or oats, and occasionally vegetables like onions, cabbage, and turnips. Meat was a rarity for peasants, usually reserved for special occasions or when the lord of the manor allowed hunting privileges. Fish was sometimes consumed, especially for religious observances during Lent, but preservation was limited. Salted or smoked fish could last longer, but it was far from fresh. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and superstition often guided treatment more than science. Illnesses that are easily treatable today, like infections, minor injuries, or fevers, were potentially fatal. Barber surgeons who cut hair and performed minor surgeries often had little understanding of sterilization or human anatomy. Remedies included herbal concoctions, prayers, and sometimes bizarre practices like bloodletting. Plagues and epidemics were devastating. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, wiped out approximately 1/3 of the population. Entire villages were decimated, leaving fields untended and societies in chaos. Life was dictated by the rigid social hierarchy. At the top were kings and nobles, owning vast estates and enjoying privileges unimaginable to the peasantry. Below them were knights, sworn to defend the land and uphold the feudal order, often engaging in brutal warfare. The majority of the population were serfs and peasants, bound to the land they worked on and obligated to provide labor, produce, or money to their lords. Freedom was scarce, and opportunities for social mobility were extremely limited. Peasants could aspire to improve their standing only rarely, often through marriage, exceptional skill, or the favor of a local lord. Religion played a central role in daily life. The church exerted immense influence over all aspects of society, from moral guidance to politics. Sunday services were not just a religious obligation, but a communal event, offering a break from toil and a chance to socialize. Religious festivals marked the agricultural calendar, bringing temporary joy and reprieve. Monks and nuns served as spiritual guides, scholars, and even medical practitioners. preserving knowledge in monasteries while maintaining strict spiritual discipline. Education was largely restricted to the elite. Most peasants remained illiterate, learning trades through hands-on experience from parents or local craftsmen. For those who could read, manuscripts and books were precious and rare, painstakingly copied by hand. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, gradually changed this, but for most of the medieval era, knowledge was a guarded privilege. In towns and cities, life was slightly different but hardly easier. Urban centers were crowded, noisy, and unsanitary. Markets bustled with activity, with merchants selling goods from faraway lands, but diseases spread rapidly in such dense populations. Fire was a constant threat, with wooden structures packed tightly together and candles or hearth fires igniting entire blocks. Guilds controlled trades, setting rules for apprenticeships, pricing, and quality of goods. For an ordinary urban worker, survival required skill, luck, and endurance. Despite these hardships, medieval people found moments of joy and celebration. Feasts, fairs, music, storytelling, and religious festivals punctuated the rhythm of work and labor. Communities were tightly knit, with neighbors relying on each other for help, protection, and companionship. Humor, games, and folklore offered a mental escape from the relentless grind of daily life. Medieval life was a continuous balance between survival, labor, and fleeting pleasures. It was a world where the line between life and death was thin, where social status determined opportunity, and where the natural world was both a provider and a threat. Understanding this reality helps us appreciate the resilience and ingenuity of the people who lived during these centuries, a resilience often overlooked in romanticized portrayals of knights and castles. Daily life, work, and survival in medieval times. As dawn broke over the medieval village, the first sounds were not of birds or gentle winds, but the clatter of humans beginning their grueling day. The peasants awoke in their cramped, dimly lit huts, often sharing the space with livestock like pigs or chickens. The warmth from these animals offered some comfort during cold nights, but the stench and noise were constant companions. Morning chores began immediately, dictated by necessity rather than leisure. Water had to be drawn from wells or nearby rivers, a physically demanding task that could consume hours. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a modest affair. Many relied on leftover bread or thin porridge, sometimes flavored with a little milk or honey if available. For the working poor, this was often the only meal for several hours of back-breaking labor. The medieval diet was heavily dependent on seasonal produce, and scarcity dictated nutrition. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were staples. Legumes, beans, and peas provided protein, but meat consumption was reserved for feast days, or granted only under the Lord's permission. Wheat, a luxury crop, produced finer bread for wealthier townsfolk, while coarser grains like rye and barley sustained peasants. Fieldwork dominated the lives of most medieval people. From dawn until dusk, men, women, and even children worked tirelessly. Plowing was done with wooden or rudimentary iron-tipped plows, often pulled by oxen or horses. Planting and harvesting required hands-on effort, with labor-intensive methods that tested endurance. Summer brought its own challenges with sweltering heat, persistent insects, and the risk of dehydration. Fall was harvest time, a critical period where failure could mean famine. Winter, though less active in terms of fieldwork, presented dangers from exposure and malnutrition. Within the village, each family had specific responsibilities. Women prepared meals, churned butter, spun wool, tended gardens, and cared for children and elderly family members. Men performed heavier labor in fields, forests, and construction tasks. Children were expected to contribute from a young age, learning the skills necessary to survive. Education for most meant practical knowledge, not literacy, learning by doing rather than reading. Despite the relentless work, community life provided cohesion. Villagers depended on each other for labor exchanges, shared harvests, and assistance in emergencies. Festivals and religious observances punctuated the arduous year, offering short-lived reprieves from labor. During such times, dancing, singing, and storytelling transformed villages into hubs of fleeting joy. Yet even these moments were intertwined with the ever-present reality of survival and social hierarchy. The physical toll of medieval life was immense. Chronic pain, injuries, and illness were commonplace. Cuts and bruises, often infected due to lack of antiseptics, could be fatal. Diseases spread rapidly, fueled by malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. The Black Death of the mid-14th century remains the most infamous example, but smaller epidemics frequently decimated communities. The understanding of medicine was rudimentary. Remedies ranged from herbal concoctions to prayer, superstition, and the occasional crude surgical intervention by a barber surgeon. Fear of illness was constant, as even minor infections could escalate into life-threatening conditions. Work extended beyond agriculture. Skilled trades such as blacksmithing, carpentry, weaving, and brewing were vital to village and town life. These craftsmen often belonged to guilds, which regulated training, quality, and economic rights. Apprenticeship was a long and demanding process where young people lived under strict supervision to master their trade. The tools were primitive by modern standards, often heavy, inefficient, and dangerous, requiring both strength and skill. Food preservation was a constant concern. Without refrigeration, peasants relied on methods such as salting, smoking, and drying to keep meat and fish edible. Storage techniques for grains and vegetables were rudimentary, exposing communities to spoilage and subsequent famine. Poor harvests, bad weather, or pest infestations could create crises, leading to widespread hunger. The scarcity of food dictated social structures and daily routines, and those who controlled the granaries wielded immense power over the village population. Transportation was limited and arduous. Most people traveled on foot, though carts drawn by oxen or horses were used for transporting goods. Roads were rough, muddy, and often dangerous, particularly in rural areas. Travel could be hampered by bandits, wild animals, or simply harsh terrain. For the average medieval person, journeys were infrequent and undertaken only when necessary, adding to the sense of confinement and reliance on local resources. Medieval towns, though bustling with trade and activity, presented a different set of challenges. Crowded streets, wooden houses built close together, and open gutters created a breeding ground for disease. Fires were frequent, devastating entire neighborhoods. Markets were vibrant and essential, with merchants bringing goods from distant regions, but access to quality products depended on wealth and social status. For peasants visiting towns, the experience was both exciting and intimidating, vibrant with activity, yet overshadowed by the constant presence of danger and scarcity. Religion remained central in daily life. Church attendance was mandatory and moral guidance was strict. Saints' feast days and holy days structured the calendar, influencing work schedules, diets, and community gatherings. Pilgrimages, though difficult, were sometimes undertaken, reflecting both piety and the desire for social mobility or miraculous intervention. Religious institutions often provided some relief in the form of charity or medical care, but they also reinforced the rigid social hierarchy and moral expectations. The social fabric of the medieval period was unyielding. Feudalism dictated obligations and loyalty, with serfs bound to landowners and lords controlling resources and justice. Rights were limited, and dissent could result in severe punishment. Wealthy landowners enjoyed relative security, better nutrition, and opportunities for education, while peasants faced a daily struggle for survival, dependent on the whims of both nature and human authority. Despite these harsh conditions, medieval people demonstrated resilience, ingenuity, and a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Survival required resourcefulness, turning limited resources into sustenance, finding community support, and navigating the ever-present threats of disease, violence, and environmental hardships. This relentless drive shaped a society that, while harsh, laid the groundwork for many cultural, technological, and social developments in the centuries to follow. Medieval society was a rigid structure largely defined by the feudal system. This hierarchical organization shaped not only the social order, but also the daily lives, rights, and responsibilities of everyone, from kings and nobles to peasants and serfs. To understand what life was really like during this period, It is crucial to examine the dynamics of power and the roles that lords, knights, and common folk played in sustaining the medieval world. At the top of the social pyramid stood the king, a figure both revered and feared. The king's authority was often considered divinely sanctioned, with the notion of the divine right of kings reinforcing his control. Yet in practice, his power was limited by the influence of nobles and regional lords, who commanded their own armies, collected taxes, and enforced justice within their territories. A king's reign was as much about diplomacy, strategic marriages, and alliances as it was about warfare and legislation. Beneath the king were the nobles, the landowners who held vast estates and wielded considerable influence. Their wealth derived primarily from land ownership, as agricultural production formed the backbone of the medieval economy. These lords had the authority to levy taxes, enforce local laws, and maintain private armies. They lived in castles or fortified manors, symbols of both protection and power, surrounded by walls, moats, and watchtowers designed to repel invaders. Life within a noble household was vastly different from that of the peasants working the surrounding lands. Lavish feasts, fine clothing, and access to education were privileges of the elite. Yet they also bore the responsibility of governing, defending, and managing their estates. Knights occupied a unique position in this hierarchy. Trained from childhood, often starting as pages and then squires, they dedicated their lives to mastering the arts of warfare, horsemanship, and weaponry. Knighthood was not only a military vocation, but also a code of conduct defined by the principles of chivalry. This included loyalty to one's lord, protection of the weak, and adherence to religious and moral duties. Knights were often deployed in battles, sieges, or raids, and their prowess on the battlefield could enhance the reputation of both themselves and their lord. However, the romantic image of knights in shining armor contrasts sharply with the grim realities. Brutal combat, disease, and political intrigue were constant threats. The relationship between lords and peasants was central to medieval life. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked on. In exchange for protection and the right to cultivate a small plot for personal use, they owed labor, produce, or rent to their lord. This could include working the lord's fields, maintaining roads, or contributing to construction projects such as bridges, walls, and fortifications. Failure to meet these obligations often resulted in harsh punishment, from fines to corporal discipline. Yet for peasants, loyalty and service were also practical strategies for survival, ensuring a degree of protection and stability in an unpredictable world. The justice system was deeply entwined with feudal obligations. Lords acted as local judges, resolving disputes and administering punishments. Laws were not codified in a modern sense. They were often customary, varying from one manor to another. Trial by ordeal, where the accused might be subjected to dangerous tests to prove innocence, was a common practice, reflecting a blend of superstition, religious authority, and local tradition. The specter of violence loomed over everyday life, reinforcing social hierarchies and instilling fear as a tool of control. Castles themselves were centers of power and hubs of social, military, and economic activity. A typical castle included fortified walls, keeps, towers, courtyards, chapels, and sometimes entire villages within its protective boundaries. Castles served multiple purposes. They were defensive strongholds during wartime, administrative centers for managing lands, and residences showcasing wealth and status. Life inside a castle could be surprisingly vibrant, with feasts, tournaments, and entertainments, but it was also demanding. Servants, soldiers, and craftsmen labored continuously to maintain the structure, prepare food, and ensure security. Disease, accidents, and constant vigilance were ever present, reminding inhabitants that even privilege did not guarantee comfort or safety. Knights' roles extended beyond war. They participated in tournaments, jousts, and displays of martial skill, which were both entertainment and training for real combat. Tournaments were social events that drew nobles, merchants, and common folk alike, offering a glimpse of grandeur and pageantry. For knights, success in tournaments could lead to honor, wealth, or political alliances. but the risk of injury or death was significant. Knights also served as enforcers of their lord's will, collecting taxes, maintaining order, or defending borders against rival lords, bandits, or invading forces. Religion intertwined with feudal obligations, influencing both governance and personal conduct. Lords and knights were expected to uphold Christian values, fund religious institutions, and support the church's authority. Monasteries and abbeys held land, produced food, and provided charity, education, and medical care. Clergy acted as intermediaries between the divine and the populace, preaching moral guidance while wielding political influence. For peasants, the church offered spiritual comfort and a framework to understand their suffering, reinforcing the existing social order while fostering hope for a better life after death. Political maneuvering was a constant aspect of medieval life. Marriages were often arranged to secure alliances, consolidate land, or strengthen claims to titles. Treaties, feuds, and wars were part of the delicate balance between kingdoms, principalities, and powerful nobles. Every action, whether on the battlefield or in the Great Hall, had repercussions, and navigating these complexities required intelligence, strategy, and sometimes ruthlessness. Life for the common people was intrinsically tied to the whims and fortunes of those above them. Peasants bore the consequences of war, famine, or poor leadership, yet they also developed networks of mutual aid, traditions, and local customs that sustained their communities. Festivals, religious observances, and communal gatherings offered respite from daily toil and reinforced social cohesion. The rhythm of the agricultural calendar dictated work, celebration, and survival, creating a structured yet unyielding framework for life in the medieval era. Despite the harsh realities, the medieval period was not devoid of culture, creativity, or ingenuity. The arts flourished in the courts and monasteries, producing illuminated manuscripts, sculptures, and architecture that continue to inspire awe. Music, storytelling, and oral traditions preserved history, morals, and local legends, connecting generations in ways that extended beyond mere survival. The resilience of people across all classes, peasants, knights, and nobles alike, shaped a society that was as complex as it was challenging, leaving a legacy that influences our understanding of history even today. Morning light seeped through cracks in the wooden shutters, illuminating the smoky haze that hung inside a medieval peasant's home. The fire from the previous night had dwindled into embers, and the cold air of dawn crept in through gaps in the walls. A rooster crowed outside, announcing another day of toil and endurance. Life in the medieval era was dictated by nature. The sun determined when people woke, worked, and rested. Artificial light was scarce, and candles were expensive. Most families relied on the glow of the hearth. Food was at the heart of daily life, not as a pleasure, but as a necessity fought for each day. Most medieval people lived under the constant pressure of scarcity. Crops failed often, winters were long, and famine could strike without warning. The diet of a peasant was basic, but surprisingly varied, depending on geography and the time of year. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal. Made from coarse grains like rye, barley, or oats, it was dense and dark, often gritty with remnants of bran, or even ground stone from the mill. Wealthier households, especially in towns or among the nobility, could afford white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour, a luxury that symbolized status as much as it satisfied hunger. Breakfast for most peasants consisted of ale, a low-alcohol beer, a small piece of bread, and perhaps a few pieces of cheese if they were fortunate. Ale was safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated from waste and runoff. The process of brewing, involving boiling and fermentation, made ale a cleaner and more nutritious beverage. Even children drank weak ale daily, and many medieval families brewed it themselves at home. Lunch and dinner were not distinct meals in the modern sense. People typically ate twice a day, one larger meal in the middle of the day and another lighter one in the evening. Pottage, a thick stew made from vegetables, grains, and occasionally scraps of meat, was a staple. The ingredients depended on what was available. Onions, leeks, cabbage, and peas formed the base, thickened with oats or barley. Meat was rare for commoners, but lords and their households consumed it frequently. Game such as deer, boar, and rabbits were hunted by the nobility, while peasants had little access to wild meat. Hunting rights were tightly controlled, and poaching could lead to severe punishment, sometimes even death. Preserving food was an ongoing challenge. Without refrigeration, people relied on salting, smoking, and pickling. Fish, especially herring, was salted and shipped inland from coastal regions, serving as an essential protein source. Salt itself was expensive, often imported, and thus another marker of wealth. Cheese, butter, and dried fruits provided variation and could be stored longer. During harsh winters, many peasants relied on stored grains and dried legumes, while nobles dined on preserved meats, imported spices, and fresh food supplied from their estates. The contrast between the diet of rich and poor was immense. While peasants struggled to find enough calories to survive, nobles feasted on roasted meats, pastries, and exotic ingredients like saffron, cinnamon, and pepper, all imported at great cost from Asia and the Middle East. Feasts were theatrical displays of power and wealth, with servants carrying whole roasted animals, decorated pies, and even illusion foods, dishes designed to look like something else entirely. Banquets could last for hours, accompanied by music, dancing, and entertainment such as jesters, troubadours, or even animal performances. Beyond food, clothing revealed one's place in the medieval hierarchy. The garments of a peasant were functional, not fashionable. Made primarily from wool or linen, they were coarse, durable, and often unwashed for long periods. Men typically wore tunics with rough hose or leggings, while women wore long dresses covered by aprons and veils. Colors were dull and earthy, browns, grays, and faded greens, the result of natural dyes or simple undyed fabrics. In contrast, the wealthy elite dressed in vibrant colors and luxurious fabrics. The nobility flaunted their status through garments made of silk, velvet, or fine wool imported from Flanders or Italy. Bright dyes, especially crimson, purple, and deep blue, were expensive and thus symbolic of power. Nobles also followed strict fashion trends, with pointed shoes, elaborate headdresses, and intricately embroidered sleeves. Even the church imposed sumptuary laws to restrict certain fabrics and colors to specific social classes, ensuring that no peasant could dress above their station. Children in the medieval world experienced a drastically different reality from modern childhood. There was little concept of adolescence or extended play. From the moment they could walk and follow instructions, children were expected to work. Peasant children helped tend animals, gather firewood, fetch water, and assist in the fields. Their toys were simple: carved wooden animals, rag dolls, or hoops made from bent branches, but imagination filled in the gaps of scarcity. For noble children, childhood was equally structured but in different ways. Boys from noble families were sent away at a young age, usually around 7, to serve as pages in another lord's household. There, they learned manners, literacy, music, and the basic skills of warfare and horsemanship. By their teenage years, they became squires, attending to knights and preparing for their own eventual knighthood. Noble girls, meanwhile, were trained in household management, embroidery, music, and social etiquette, often preparing for arranged marriages that would strengthen family alliances. Education in the medieval era was rare and class-dependent. Monasteries and cathedral schools provided instruction to boys of noble or clerical families, focusing on Latin, scripture, and philosophy. Peasants, by contrast, learned through oral tradition and practical experience. Only a fraction of the population could read or write. The church's control over literacy meant that written knowledge was concentrated among monks and priests, who painstakingly copied manuscripts by hand in candlelit scriptoria. Recreation and entertainment varied by class, but were essential to break the monotony of daily labor. Peasants celebrated festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, harvests, saints' days, and seasonal fairs, with dancing, singing, and communal feasts. These events blended religious devotion with joy, allowing people to momentarily escape the grind of subsistence life. Games like wrestling, archery contests, dice, and early forms of football, often violent and chaotic, were common in villages. For the nobility, leisure was far more elaborate. Hunting was the ultimate aristocratic pastime, combining sport, power, and prestige. Falconry, training birds of prey to hunt small animals, was another favored activity among the wealthy. Banquets, poetry recitals, and courtly love rituals entertained noble households, reflecting both refinement and social competition. Tournaments, where knights displayed martial skill through jousting or mock battles, were the medieval equivalent of grand spectacles, drawing crowds from across the region. Evenings in the medieval world brought a different kind of quiet. As darkness fell, people gathered around hearth fires, the heart of every home. The fire provided light, warmth, and a sense of safety. Stories were told, legends of saints, tales of local heroes, or frightening accounts of witches, spirits, and miracles. Oral storytelling was both entertainment and education, passing down moral lessons and collective memories from one generation to the next. At night, danger lurked outside. With no street lighting and few patrols, towns and villages became perilous after sundown. Wild animals, bandits, or even supernatural fears kept most people indoors. The night was long, cold, and filled with silence, punctuated only by the crackle of fire or the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. Sleep came in phases. People often woke in the middle of the night, prayed, tended fires, or spoke quietly before drifting back to sleep until dawn. As the bells of the church tolled across the misty fields of a medieval morning, the sound echoed through every corner of life. It wasn't merely a call to prayer. It was the heartbeat of an age that understood the world through faith, fear, and mystery. Religion was not a separate part of existence. It was existence itself. Every thought, every action, and every breath was filtered through divine interpretation. In a world filled with hardship, the promise of heaven and the threat of hell were more real than the ground beneath one's feet. The church stood at the center of medieval life, a towering institution of both comfort and control. Its cathedrals loomed like mountains of stone, their walls covered in sacred carvings, their ceilings painted with scenes of heaven and damnation. To walk into a church was to step into the universe's order, the smell of incense, the flickering of candles, the chant of Latin prayers that few peasants understood, but all felt deeply. Religion offered structure to chaos. It gave meaning to famine, plague, and war. If a child died, it was God's will. If crops failed, it was divine punishment. If a king triumphed, it was God's favor manifest on earth. For the average peasant, daily life was a balance between devotion and dread. The priest was one of the few literate men in a village, the interpreter of divine mysteries and moral law. His words carried more weight than those of any noble. Baptisms, marriages, confessions, and funerals, all were under the church's authority. The rhythm of the year was determined by the liturgical calendar. Advent, Lent, Easter, the Feast of the Assumption, All Saints' Day. Each holy day brought both obligation and relief. A pause in labor, a gathering of community, and a brief taste of joy amid survival. But faith in the medieval world was not pure or serene. It was interwoven with fear. Hell was not a metaphor. It was a vivid, ever-present threat. Churches depicted the damned burning in eternal flames, demons tearing at flesh, sinners chained for eternity. The average villager lived in constant anxiety about sin, lust, pride, greed, gluttony, anger, sloth, envy. Even thoughts could condemn the soul. Indulgences, confessions, and acts of penance were the only shields against the infernal abyss. A man might walk barefoot to a distant shrine or lash himself in repentance, hoping to spare his soul eternal torment. Amid this spiritual intensity, medieval medicine evolved as a fusion of faith, superstition, and rudimentary science. The human body was understood through the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on the balance of these fluids. A fever, for instance, was thought to result from an excess of blood, and so the cure was often bloodletting, performed by a barber surgeon using leeches or blades. Patients weakened, infections worsened, but the belief in the method remained unshaken. Hospitals, where they existed, were run by religious orders. The sick were seen not merely as patients, but as souls to be comforted. Nuns tended to wounds with herbs and prayers. Monks copied medical manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the writings of ancient physicians like Galen and Hippocrates. Remedies combined herbal knowledge with mysticism: rosemary for memory, sage for strength, garlic to ward off evil spirits. Amulets, charms, and relics were commonly worn to protect against disease. Even learned physicians would recommend prayers alongside potions, for the boundary between medicine and miracle was blurred. Then came the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe was consumed by the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. Entire villages vanished. The air filled with the stench of decay. Families abandoned one another. Priests refused to enter homes, and graveyards overflowed. No one understood the cause. Theories ranged from poisoned air to divine wrath to alignment of the planets. Flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves in atonement, believing that humanity's sins had brought this horror upon them. The Church struggled to explain why God allowed such suffering, and cracks began to form in its once unshakable authority. Yet even then, faith endured, twisted, wounded, but alive. Superstition thrived in the absence of understanding. Every strange illness, every miscarriage, every storm had a spiritual explanation. Witches were blamed for blighted crops, demons for madness, and fairies for the disappearance of children. The belief in magic was universal, from noble courts consulting astrologers to peasants leaving offerings at sacred trees. The Church condemned such practices, yet the line between religion and superstition was porous. A villager might attend Mass in the morning and whisper a charm over his cattle in the evening. The medieval mind saw no contradiction. The world was alive with unseen forces, both divine and demonic. Medicine's tools were crude: knives, saws, leeches, cautery irons heated red-hot in fire. Surgery was often performed without anesthesia, a luxury not yet discovered. The screams of patients echoed through stone chambers while assistants held them down. Amputations, tooth extractions, and trepanation, drilling into the skull to release bad spirits, were horrifyingly common. Mortality rates were staggering. And yet, within monasteries and early universities, a quiet revolution was beginning. Scholars translated Arabic medical texts, studied anatomy, and challenged superstition with observation. It was slow, fragile progress, but it marked the first glimmer of modern science. Daily life continued amid these fears and faiths. Women were midwives and healers, passing down herbal knowledge from mother to daughter. Their skill often drew suspicion, as healing too effectively could be seen as witchcraft. The same hands that comforted the sick might one day be accused of consorting with the devil. Trial by water or fire, the tests of innocence, were grim rituals that reflected humanity's desperation to understand the inexplicable. Faith also guided the architecture of hope. Pilgrimages became both spiritual journeys and social events. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to touch relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, drops of holy blood, seeking healing or absolution. Their routes crossed kingdoms, bringing commerce, communication, and a sense of shared identity to a fragmented Europe. The act of pilgrimage itself became a metaphor for life, painful, uncertain, yet driven by purpose. In noble courts, religion was a performance as well as a conviction. Kings built chapels and monasteries to demonstrate piety. Knights fought under the banner of the cross in crusades, believing that dying in battle for God's glory guaranteed eternal salvation. Yet greed, politics, and faith were so intertwined that it was often impossible to separate them. The same holy wars that promised salvation also brought slaughter, conquest, and suffering to distant lands. For the medieval mind, heaven and hell were not abstract destinations, but real landscapes. Heaven was a radiant city of gold and light, filled with song and peace. Hell was a pit of endless fire and torment. Every sermon, every piece of art, every public execution reinforced these visions. Life itself was only a brief, painful passage, a test of endurance before eternity. The Church taught that suffering purified the soul. Thus, poverty and hardship were not curses, but divine gifts in disguise. Despite the weight of faith and fear, human compassion persisted. People prayed for their sick neighbors, gave alms to the poor, and cared for orphans and widows. Even in plague-stricken towns, there were those who risked their lives to bury the dead, believing it a sacred duty. In monasteries, monks preserved not only scripture, but knowledge, copying manuscripts of science, philosophy, and medicine that would later fuel the Renaissance. By the end of the Middle Ages, Europe had been transformed by both devotion and doubt. The plague, the Crusades, and the slow dawn of inquiry had reshaped belief. The Church remained powerful, but its authority had been questioned. The seeds of modern science and humanism were planted in the soil of faith, watered by centuries of fear and wonder. For the people who lived through it, life in the medieval world was a constant negotiation with the unknown. Faith gave them courage to endure suffering. Superstition gave them explanations for what they could not comprehend. Between the sacred and the superstitious, between healing and harm, they carved meaning out of a world that seemed forever poised between light and darkness. The clang of steel was the music of the medieval world. Long before the gunpowder age, battle was a brutal symphony of iron and flesh, where courage and cruelty danced together in the mud. To understand medieval life fully, one must walk into its wars, not just the grand clashes of kings, but the endless skirmishes, sieges, and raids that shaped every generation. For a man born into the medieval world, war was not a rare event. It was the natural rhythm of existence. Lords fought for land, kings for crowns, knights for glory, and peasants because they had no choice. A single call from a feudal lord could summon every able-bodied man to arms. The banner would rise, the horn would sound, and men would leave their plows in the field to take up spears. Before a battle, the air was thick with smoke and prayer. Priests blessed the troops, sprinkling holy water over mail-clad soldiers. Deus vult, God wills it, the cry of the Crusaders, echoed across centuries. Every side believed God was with them, that their cause was righteous, that heaven watched their blades. And yet, when the sun rose on the battlefield, what followed was carnage beyond reason. A knight's armor was both his pride and his prison. Forged by hand, it could weigh up to 30 kilograms, a gleaming cage of steel. Beneath it, the knight wore a padded gambeson to soften the blows. Mounting a warhorse, a destrier bred for power, not speed, he was a moving fortress, capable of shattering enemy lines with sheer momentum. His sword was a symbol of nobility, his lance an instrument of death, his shield marked with his family's coat of arms. But battle was not a fair contest between equals. For every armored knight, there were dozens of foot soldiers, peasants armed with little more than wooden spears, axes, or slings. The chaos of combat was overwhelming, arrows whistling through the air, the thunder of hooves, the screams of the dying. Mud turned red. The stench of sweat, blood, and fear mingled with the sound of metal striking metal. The tactics of medieval warfare were simple but devastating. At the core stood the feudal levy, men compelled by duty, not training. They followed their lord into battle, often terrified, often hungry. The archers were the great equalizers, especially the English longbowmen, whose arrows could pierce armor at 200 yards. Entire cavalry charges were stopped mid-gallop by volleys of arrows, horses collapsing, riders crushed under the weight of fallen comrades. Sieges were the true art of medieval war. Long, miserable affairs that tested both patience and cruelty. Castles, with their towering walls and deep moats, were symbols of power, but also targets. To capture one, attackers used trebuchets, massive wooden engines that hurled stones the size of boulders, and battering rams and siege towers crawling slowly across the battlefield. Defenders poured boiling oil, tar, or molten lead on invaders. Disease spread quickly in the close quarters of a siege. Starvation claimed more lives than swords. Inside a besieged castle, food dwindled fast. Horses, dogs, even rats became precious meals. The dead were buried shallowly, or not at all. In desperation, some chronicles claim there were even acts of cannibalism, though the church forbade the telling of such horrors. When surrender came, it was rarely merciful. The victors looted, burned, and slaughtered to remind others what defiance cost. And yet, amid this brutality, the medieval mind saw war as honorable, even sacred. The code of chivalry shaped the identity of the knight, a moral ideal that demanded bravery, loyalty, and mercy, even in killing. A knight swore to protect the weak, defend his faith, and serve his lord with honor. Reality, of course, often betrayed these ideals. Many knights were mercenaries, their swords for hire, yet the myth of the noble warrior endured, sung by troubadours in courts, immortalized in the tales of King Arthur and his Round Table. To be a knight was to belong to an elite brotherhood. Training began in childhood. A boy of noble birth became a page at age 7, serving a lord's household, learning manners, riding, and the basics of combat. At 14, he became a squire, caring for his master's armor, weaponry, and horse. He trained relentlessly, sword drills, jousting, hunting, and battlefield exercises. At 21, after years of service, he was dubbed a knight in a solemn ceremony. A night-long vigil in a chapel, prayers whispered over his armor, and at dawn, the touch of a sword on his shoulder. Arise, Sir Knight. Tournaments offered a bloodless echo of war. Knights competed in jousts, charging at each other with lances on horseback, splintering wood upon shields. The spectacle drew crowds from miles away. Lords and ladies cheered, bards sang, and merchants sold trinkets and banners. For many knights, tournaments were both training and theater, a chance to earn fame, fortune, and the attention of noblewomen. But beyond the tournaments and songs, the reality of war was horror. In the fields after battle, corpses lay unburied, picked at by crows. The wounded groaned for days. There were no hospitals, only crude tents where surgeons used hot irons to cauterize wounds. The stench of rot and infection was unbearable. Prayer was often the only medicine, and when winter came, armies froze in the mud, their armor rusting, their bellies empty. For women, war was another form of siege. When men went to fight, they were left to guard homes, manage estates, or face raiders alone. Noblewomen sometimes commanded castles, negotiated ransoms, or even led troops. But most women suffered the consequences of war. Villages burned, families scattered, and starvation following armies like shadows. The Crusades were the grandest wars of all, a collision of faith, greed, and destiny. From the late 11th century onward, waves of European knights marched east under the banner of the cross, seeking to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. To the church, these were holy missions. To many knights, they were also opportunities for wealth and adventure. The journey was long and deadly. Deserts, disease, and ambushes claimed thousands. Cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Acre became battlegrounds soaked in blood. The Crusaders committed atrocities in the name of God, slaughtering entire populations. But their campaigns also brought unexpected consequences. Trade routes reopened, ideas flowed between cultures, and Europe's isolation began to erode. From the Muslim world, Europeans learned advanced medicine, mathematics, and architecture, seeds that would one day blossom into the Renaissance. As the centuries passed, warfare itself evolved. Armor grew heavier, castles taller, and armies larger. The invention of the crossbow, a weapon powerful enough to pierce a knight's plate, terrified the nobility. The church even declared it unholy to use against Christians, yet progress could not be stopped. By the 14th century, gunpowder arrived in Europe. Cannons shattered castle walls that had stood for generations. The age of the armored knight began to fade, replaced by infantry and artillery. Still, the image of the knight, noble, gallant, unwavering, endured in legend. Even as wars grew larger and more impersonal, people looked back to the age of chivalry with nostalgia. Songs of heroism outlived the men who inspired them. Chronicles written by monks turned battlefields into moral tales. Stories of divine justice, betrayal, and redemption. Behind the glory, however, were the nameless dead, the peasants who marched barefoot, the women who starved behind walls, the children who never saw their fathers return. War was the forge in which the Middle Ages shaped its destiny, both its cruelty and its courage. It was war that built kingdoms and toppled them, that united people under banners and tore them apart in blood. in the flicker of firelight. A blacksmith hammered out a new sword while a priest whispered a prayer. Outside, the stars shone over a scarred land, fields trampled, villages burnt, graves freshly dug. Yet life persisted. The plow would soon follow the sword, rebuilding what war had destroyed. And somewhere, a child dreamed of growing up to be a knight, not knowing that the age of chivalry was already dying and that the world was about to change forever. The world was changing. Slowly, like the turning of a great wheel, the medieval order that had ruled for centuries began to creak and shift. The clang of swords gave way to the hum of markets, and the smoky smell of war was replaced by the scent of bread, leather, and spice. Across Europe, towns that had once been little more than fortified villages started to swell with life. The age of endless lords and peasants was giving birth to something new, the age of merchants, craftsmen, and ideas. At the edges of old feudal estates, along rivers and crossroads, trade awakened like a heartbeat. Farmers who once lived their entire lives in the shadow of a single castle now found themselves walking to weekly markets, carrying baskets of grain, eggs, or wool. The coin, once a rare object seen only by nobles and tax collectors, began to jingle in calloused hands. With trade came independence, and with independence, curiosity. In the heart of these growing towns stood the marketplace, chaotic, colorful, alive. Merchants from distant lands spread their wares on rough wooden tables. The shouts of bargaining echoed between half-timbered houses. Fishmongers shouted prices over the smell of salt and scales. Butchers swung cleavers, splattering blood on straw-covered floors. Cloth traders ran their fingers over bolts of dyed fabric, boasting of the rarity of their colors. The air was thick with humanity, sweat, laughter, arguments, and ambition. Guilds emerged, bringing order to this chaos. A guild was more than a union. It was a family, a brotherhood of skill and secrecy. Each craft, blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, masons, carpenters, had its own rules, its own oaths, its own hierarchy. A boy would begin as an apprentice, sweeping floors and fetching tools, learning the mysteries of the trade. Years later, he would become a journeyman, traveling from town to town, honing his craft. Only when his skill and reputation were proven could he present a masterpiece to the guild masters and be declared a master himself. These guilds shaped medieval towns as surely as knights shaped the battlefield. They built cathedrals that pierced the heavens, designed bridges that outlasted dynasties, and filled Europe with a sense of progress unknown to the peasant world. Artisans took pride not just in survival but in creation. For the first time in centuries, beauty became a form of work. Within the walls of towns, life took on a rhythm utterly different from the countryside. The streets were narrow and winding, often ankle-deep in filth. Pigs and chickens roamed freely, and open drains carried waste to nearby rivers. Yet there was vitality in the air, the sense of motion, of growth, the sound of hammers, the ring of church bells, the chatter of foreign tongues from travelers who arrived with goods from places that seemed like legends. Venice, Constantinople, Cairo. As trade expanded, so too did the reach of knowledge. Merchants returned from faraway lands, not only with silk and spices, but with ideas, stories of strange devices, new ways of measuring time, philosophies from the East. The old barriers between sacred and secular knowledge began to blur. In monasteries, where monks once copied religious texts alone, scholars now debated mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Ancient Greek and Arabic works were being translated into Latin, and Europe, long asleep in dogma, began to stir. Money transformed everything. For centuries, wealth had been measured in land and loyalty. Now it could fit in a leather pouch. Banking families in Italy, the Medici, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, began lending money to kings. Trade routes stretched across mountains and seas, and the medieval world, once small and enclosed, started to open outward. Maps grew more accurate. Horizons seemed less frightening. The idea that a man could rise through wit and work, not just birth, began to take root, quietly, dangerously. Yet this new world was not born without struggle. The old order clung to power with mailed fists. Feudal lords imposed taxes on trade, demanding tolls for passage on roads and rivers. The church warned against the sin of usury, condemning moneylenders as immoral. But the current of change could not be stopped. Markets grew despite prohibitions. People gathered, traded, learned, and built. The seeds of cities like Paris, London, Bruges, and Florence were watered by human ambition. In the evenings, when the market stalls closed and the torches were lit, towns came alive with another kind of commerce, that of stories, songs, and ideas. Minstrels wandered the streets, playing lutes and singing tales of faraway lands. The common folk, who once knew only the rhythms of harvest and prayer, now found themselves part of something larger, a human web stretching across continents. In crowded taverns, over ale and laughter, the future was being whispered into existence. Architecture became an expression of this new energy. Cathedrals rose higher and higher, their spires in stained glass like frozen prayers. These were not just places of worship, they were civic pride, the heart of the town. To build one could take generations. Fathers would lay the foundation stones that their grandsons would never see completed. Inside, light poured through colored glass, transforming sunlight into visions of divine radiance. Universities began to appear, first in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, places where scholars gathered to argue, to read, to question. Students arrived from all over Europe, wearing simple robes, sleeping in shared quarters, living on bread and beer. The subjects they studied, logic, rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, theology, were revolutionary in a world still ruled by faith. They asked questions once forbidden. How does the world move? What is the nature of man? Can reason coexist with belief? The printing press had not yet come, but the hunger for knowledge was already spreading like fire. Books were copied by hand, line by line, often illuminated with gold leaf. To own a single manuscript was a luxury, a treasure worth more than a house. Yet within these pages, humanity was rediscovering its curiosity. The same spark that had built cathedrals and forged swords now turned toward thought itself. Not all towns were prosperous, and not all lives improved. Disease still haunted crowded streets. Fires could devour entire districts in hours. The smell of tanneries and butchers' stalls filled the air. Crime was rampant. Punishment was swift. Stocks, pillories, and gallows stood in market squares as grim reminders of order's fragility. Yet people came nonetheless, drawn by the chance of something more, a life measured not by birthright, but by ambition. As the centuries rolled on, the balance of power shifted. Kings began to rely less on knights and more on coin. Armies of paid soldiers replaced feudal levies. The merchant's gold could buy what the noble's title could not. And slowly, imperceptibly, the old medieval world of rigid hierarchy began to loosen. The human spirit, long shackled by fear and obedience, began to rise. Painters started depicting not only saints and angels, but ordinary people. Poets wrote in the language of the street, not just in Latin. In Florence, artists like Giotto painted faces that looked alive. In England, Chaucer wrote of pilgrims and innkeepers. The divine was still there, but now, alongside it, stood humanity, flawed, beautiful, and curious. Change brought tension. The church, sensing its grip weakening, clung harder to authority. Yet no power could silence the whisper spreading through every workshop and study hall. That the world was vast, that truth might be discovered, that man himself might be more than a sinner crawling toward salvation. From the dark soil of medieval Europe, something new was sprouting. The tools were the same, hands, faith, hope, but the direction was different. Where once men built to honor God, now they began to build to understand Him and themselves. The bells still rang from church towers, but below them, in crowded streets and smoky taverns, another sound was rising, the sound of thought. And as dawn broke over the rooftops of a bustling town, carts already rumbling toward the market and apprentices opening their shutters, no one could see it clearly yet, but the Middle Ages were ending. The world was waking up. Dawn broke differently now. It was no longer the cold gray light of medieval mornings, but a softer golden glow that touched the edges of a world being reborn. Across Europe, A quiet revolution was spreading, not of swords and kings, but of minds. The centuries of silence, of fear, of obedience to mystery, were giving way to a new music, the sound of discovery, of human hands reaching beyond heaven toward the stars. In the bustling workshops of Florence, painters mixed colors that no one had seen before. Pigments ground from lapis lazuli, cinnabar and ochre, capturing the light of life itself. Brushes traced the contours of real faces, not just holy icons. For the first time, God was not the only subject of beauty. Man himself became divine. A young artist, Leonardo, watched shadows fall across a wall and wondered how the eye truly saw. To him, light was no longer a symbol, it was a science. The Renaissance had no single birthplace. It was a fire lit in 100 minds at once. In Florence, Venice, Rome, Paris, even far-off Bruges and Nuremberg, the world began to think again. Knowledge long buried under centuries of dust emerged from monastery vaults. Scrolls of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Galen. Scholars translated ancient Greek and Arabic texts into Latin, their candlelight flickering over fragile parchment. What had once been heresy, curiosity, experimentation, questioning, became the heartbeat of a new era. The sound of the city had changed. The rhythm of hammers and bells was joined by the scratching of pens, the turning of pages, the hum of presses that would soon change everything. For centuries, books had been treasures, copied by hand in silence. Now, with Gutenberg's invention of movable type, they could be multiplied endlessly. Ideas, once confined to the few, spread like wildfire among the many. Within a generation, Europe was flooded with words, sermons, poems, treatises, maps, stories. Knowledge escaped its cage. In universities and workshops, men dissected not only texts, but the human body itself. Anatomists drew what they saw, not what old authorities had written. The church still frowned upon such acts, but the thirst for truth was stronger than fear. In secret chambers, dissections revealed the elegant machinery of flesh, bones, muscles, veins, the architecture of life. Painters turned their sketches into art. Doctors turned them into understanding. The body was no longer a vessel of sin, but a masterpiece of design. Everywhere, the air felt charged. Architects imagined cathedrals not as fortresses of faith, but as symphonies of proportion. Brunelleschi raised the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, a feat of engineering so daring that people believed it impossible until it stood before them, floating like a miracle of stone. The secret was mathematics, geometry, balance, harmony. Art and science had begun to speak the same language. In this new light, even the heavens changed. For centuries, the stars had been immutable symbols of divine order. Then, a quiet Polish cleric named Copernicus dared to write what his eyes told him, that the earth was not the center of the universe. The sun, not man, held the throne. The manuscript lay hidden for years, too dangerous to publish. But its truth, once spoken, would change everything, not just the heavens, but humanity's place within them. Explorers, too, felt the pull of this new world. Maps, once filled with sea monsters and blank edges, began to stretch toward the unknown. Sailors in wooden ships charted courses across vast oceans, guided by stars and courage. In 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain and stumbled upon continents unseen by Europe, lands that would soon be conquered, mapped, and transformed forever. The horizon itself no longer seemed a boundary, but an invitation. But discovery came at a cost. For every artist painting beauty, there was a conquistador drawing blood. The same curiosity that opened the skies also unleashed greed across oceans. New worlds were not only found, they were taken. The Renaissance was a birth, but like all births, it came with pain. The old world gasped as gold, spices, and slaves flowed through its veins. In the cities, power shifted again. The merchant princes of Florence and Venice rivaled kings in wealth and taste. Their palaces gleamed with marble and frescoes, their patronage turning artists into legends. Michelangelo sculpted David from a block of flawed marble, a man, not a god, but perfect in his imperfection. In Rome, he climbed scaffolds to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where creation stretched out its hand toward man, not above him, but beside him. The printing press gave birth to revolution. Pamphlets and tracts flew across Europe like arrows. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his complaints to a church door, not knowing that he had struck a match to centuries of faith. His words, printed and reprinted, questioned the church's corruption, indulgences, and dogma. The Reformation tore Christendom in two. For the first time, people read the Bible in their own languages and dared to interpret it themselves. The Word of God became the Word of man. War and faith collided again, but now the battles were of ideology as much as of armies. Across Europe, churches burned, families divided, kings chose sides. Yet beneath the conflict, the idea had already taken root, that the mind was its own authority. Science advanced with the same restless energy. Astronomers built instruments to read the heavens. Physicians cataloged diseases. Inventors experimented with machines. In Venice, glassmakers learned to create lenses so clear they revealed worlds too small to see. In the Netherlands, an artist named Vermeer painted light so precisely it seemed to breathe. The boundary between observation and creation dissolved. The Renaissance was not only a time of genius, it was a time of awakening to the self. Portraits replaced icons. People wanted to be remembered, not as souls waiting for judgment, but as individuals, thinkers, lovers, rulers, dreamers. The human face became the new scripture and art its gospel. In workshops, apprentices learned perspective, how lines converged, how the world could be captured as the eye saw it. The illusion of depth was no longer magic but geometry. Painters and architects shared notebooks with mathematicians. The same minds that designed domes also invented flying machines. The distance between heaven and earth grew smaller with every discovery. The old medieval fear, that curiosity led to sin, faded. In its place rose a new creed, that to understand creation was to honor the Creator. Scholars spoke of humanitas, the worth of man, the dignity of knowledge, the moral duty to think. It was a dangerous faith, but it was also beautiful. In cities like Florence and Milan, art and ambition became the pulse of life. The streets glowed with lanterns at night, filled with laughter, music, and the smell of roasted chestnuts. Courtyards echoed with the sound of poetry and philosophy. Everywhere people talked about love, about the soul, about the stars. Humanity was rediscovering its voice. And yet, shadows lingered. The church still burned heretics. The Inquisition still whispered in the dark. Many of those who dreamed of truth paid for it in blood. Giordano Bruno, who dared to say that the universe was infinite, was burned alive. Galileo, who built telescopes to see the heavens, was forced to kneel and renounce his discoveries. But the flame they carried could not be extinguished. The world had seen too much light to return to darkness. By the late 15th century, Europe had become a continent in motion. Ships on every sea, presses in every city, new ideas spreading faster than any army could march. The old medieval world of castles, lords, and rigid faith had crumbled into memory. In its place stood something restless and radiant, the beginning of modern humanity. The streets were still narrow, the air still thick with smoke, but there was a new sound beneath it all. The turning of gears, the scratching of quills, the heartbeat of invention. From Florence to London, from Lisbon to Krakow, the world was humming with possibility. No one living then could see how far it would go. They could not imagine telescopes that would map the stars, machines that would cross oceans without sails, voices captured and carried through air. But they could feel it, a trembling, unstoppable force rising in the soul of mankind. And as evening fell across the cities of this new age, candles flickered in 1,000 windows. In one, a painter leaned over a canvas, trying to catch the color of dusk. In another, a scholar copied equations by the dim glow of an oil lamp. In yet another, a printer set fresh type, preparing to press words that would travel farther than he ever could. The world had changed. The Middle Ages were gone. Humanity, for the first time, had looked up, and instead of seeing only heaven, it had begun to see itself. The air of Europe was different now. The smoke of medieval hearths and the dust of cathedral stones had given way to something electric, an invisible current of thought racing from mind to mind. The Renaissance had opened the door, but now, men and women were stepping fully into the room, curious, skeptical, alive with the conviction that the universe itself could be understood. It was no longer enough to paint beauty or to copy the ancients. The thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries wanted to know why. Why did apples fall? Why did planets move as they did? Why did light bend and shadow fade? For the first time, because God made it so was not an answer. It was a question waiting to be proved. In candle-lit studies across Europe, quiet revolutions began. A mathematician in England sat beneath an apple tree and wondered whether the same force that pulled fruit to the ground might hold the moon in its orbit. His name was Isaac Newton, and in his hands, the universe was no longer divine chaos. It was a machine, elegant and predictable, ruled by laws of motion and gravity. The age of reason had begun. Philosophers gathered in smoky Parisian salons, debating liberty, government, and the rights of man. In coffeehouses from London to Vienna, pamphlets and manifestos circulated faster than the authorities could suppress them. The press, that humble invention of Gutenberg, had become a weapon sharper than any sword. Ideas became contagious. "Dare to know," said Immanuel Kant, and the world listened. In the wake of the Renaissance's art came the Enlightenment's logic. The cosmos, once ruled by mystery, was being mapped, measured, tested. Telescopes stretched vision to the stars. Microscopes revealed universes hidden in a drop of water. The same Europe that once burned men for questioning heaven now celebrated the act of asking. Curiosity had become virtue. Empires, too, began to stir. With discovery came ambition and greed. Ships bearing the flags of England, Spain, France, and Portugal sailed to every corner of the globe. The world, for the first time, was connected by trade, conquest, and curiosity alike. From the Americas came gold, silver, and tobacco. From Africa, the cruel chains of the slave trade. From Asia, silks and spices and stories. The map of the earth, once filled with blank spaces and dragons, now bore the outlines of continents and colonies. But with knowledge came conscience. In candlelit studies, philosophers wrote not of kings and gods, but of people. John Locke spoke of natural rights, life, liberty, property. Montesquieu argued for balance of power. Rousseau dreamed of freedom and equality. Their words, printed and spread, would ignite revolutions. The old order trembled. In 1776, across the Atlantic, 13 colonies declared that all men were created equal and had the right to govern themselves. In 1789, Paris exploded, not with art this time, but with anger. The French Revolution tore down the symbols of monarchy, and the streets ran red with the blood of both tyrants and idealists. The Enlightenment had given birth to liberty and to chaos. In laboratories and workshops, another kind of revolution was brewing. In smoky foundries and damp factories, machines began to roar. The Industrial Revolution was not born from kings or philosophers, but from inventors, restless minds who dreamed of turning fire and steam into power. In England, James Watt refined the steam engine. In the fields, spinning jennies and power looms transformed cloth-making from an art to an industry. Iron bridges spanned rivers, railways cut through forests, and cities rose in clouds of soot. Humanity had mastered nature's forces, or so it believed. The world that had once been measured by the sound of church bells was now ruled by the ticking of machines. Time itself had changed, precise, relentless, mechanical. Where medieval peasants had lived by sunrise and sunset, the factory worker lived by the whistle. The age of reason had become the age of industry, but progress had its price. The same fire that powered engines blackened skies. Child labor filled the mills. Disease spread through crowded streets. While some built fortunes, others coughed their lives away in tenements. The dream of the Enlightenment, of freedom and human dignity, seemed to fade beneath the weight of smoke and steel. And yet, even in the grime of progress, new voices rose. Writers, poets, and thinkers began to ask what had been lost. The Romantics turned back to nature, to emotion, to the spirit that reason could not quantify. Wordsworth wrote of the still, sad music of humanity. Mary Shelley imagined Frankenstein, a man who created life only to be haunted by it. The machine age had birthed its first moral reckoning. Across the Atlantic, the New World became a mirror of the old, repeating its triumphs and tragedies. The same age that saw the birth of democracy also saw the horrors of slavery, war, and conquest. The Enlightenment's promise of equality proved fragile when measured against human greed. Still, knowledge marched forward. In France, a man named Pasteur studied disease and discovered the invisible world of germs. In England, Darwin sailed to distant islands and returned with a dangerous idea that all life, including man, was shaped by evolution. It was a theory that shook the foundation of faith once again, as deeply as Copernicus had done centuries earlier. Meanwhile, light itself was being conquered. Electricity, mysterious, invisible, powerful, became the new magic. In cities, flickering lamps turned night into day. Telegraphs carried messages across continents. Later, voices would travel through wires and images would move on screens. The gods of thunder and lightning had been tamed by human hands. But beneath the triumphs of science, the same old questions lingered. Who are we? Why are we here? Can reason alone fill the space once occupied by faith? The philosophers of the 19th century wrestled with these ghosts. Nietzsche declared that God was dead, not slain by violence, but by understanding. Kierkegaard replied that man still needed meaning. Freud peered into the unconscious mind and found new mysteries within. The search for truth, it seemed, had only grown deeper. In every era, the pendulum swung from faith to reason, from order to chaos, from creation to destruction. Humanity was learning, but it was also forgetting. The same curiosity that built telescopes also built cannons. The same ingenuity that made engines also made empires. By the late 19th century, the world had shrunk. Steamships and railways stitched continents together. Telegraph cables crossed oceans. News that once took months now traveled in minutes. For the first time, mankind could truly see itself. A single species spread across a finite planet. And yet, the more it saw, the less it understood. The confidence of the Enlightenment began to waver. The perfect clockwork universe of Newton no longer fit the new discoveries of physics. Einstein's relativity and quantum theory shattered the illusion of certainty. The universe was not a tidy machine. It was strange, vast, and alive with possibility. Civilizations had risen from superstition to science, from candles to electricity, from scrolls to newspapers, but the human heart, that ancient mystery, remained the same. Men still prayed, still dreamed, still feared the dark. The Middle Ages had once believed that heaven ruled the earth. The Enlightenment believed that man did. But as the 19th century drew to a close, a quiet realization began to form that both were wrong. The truth was more complex, more fragile, more beautiful, that humanity was not master or servant, but participant, woven into the same cosmic fabric it sought to understand. As the last light of the 1800s faded, the world stood on the edge of something new again. Machines could fly. Voices could be recorded. The atom, once thought indivisible, was trembling with secrets. The old certainties of faith, of science, of progress were about to be tested in ways no one could imagine. And somewhere, in the glow of a gaslit street, a scholar looked up at the stars, not with fear, not with worship, but with wonder. He knew that the journey from the medieval world to this modern one had not been a straight line, but a spiral, forever returning, forever reaching. Humanity had walked through fire and shadow, through faith and reason, and now stood at the threshold of a century that would change everything again. The Middle Ages were a distant memory, but the story, the human story, was far from over. The 20th century did not arrive quietly. It came roaring in with engines, electricity, and ambition, a century born of light and sound. Cities glowed like constellations, steel towers pierced the clouds, and men spoke across oceans through invisible waves. The world that had once taken months to cross could now be traversed in days. The human dream, once confined to parchment and prayer, was now written in smoke trails above the sky. Yet beneath the hum of machines, the old shadows stirred. The same genius that had tamed nature now sought to control humanity itself. Empires, once built on faith, reassembled under flags and ideologies. The Great War erupted like a storm. Trenches carved into the flesh of Europe, millions swallowed by mud and fire. Men who had once believed themselves masters of progress now huddled in fear as machines of death filled the air with poison. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world stood stunned. The faith in reason, in progress, in order, lay shattered alongside the bodies of a generation. The cathedrals of the Middle Ages had been replaced by factories, and the prayers had become the whine of sirens. The modern age, it seemed, had learned how to build, but not yet how to live. And still, humanity rose again. In the 1920s, cities pulsed with new rhythm. Jazz spilled from hidden bars. Women cut their hair and claimed their voices. Machines danced in sync with human dreams. The airplane, once a miracle, became a symbol of freedom. The world was shrinking, and for a moment it seemed beautiful again. But progress, like history, never stands still. The roar of the 1930s was not of celebration, but of fear. Across continents, dictators rose, promising order where chaos lingered. In Germany, one man's twisted vision turned science and nationalism into weapons. The Second World War would consume more than just nations. It would devour humanity's very soul. The bombs fell not only on soldiers, but on cities, on families, on children, on art and memory. The Holocaust revealed the darkest corners of the human mind, proving that even in an age of enlightenment, barbarism still breathed beneath the surface. When the first atomic bomb lit the sky over Hiroshima, the light of knowledge finally became indistinguishable from the light of destruction. The same hand that painted the Sistine Chapel could now unmake the world with the push of a button. After 1945, silence. The earth itself seemed to grieve. The war had ended, but the peace was uneasy, divided by walls of ideology. East and West, capitalism and communism, democracy and dictatorship, the Cold War froze the world in tension. Men looked upward again, not to heaven, but to space, searching for meaning among the stars. In 1961, a rocket pierced the sky. Humanity had finally broken free of the planet that birthed it. Gagarin's voice echoed from orbit. "I see no God up here." It was both triumph and tragedy, the culmination of centuries of human striving, and yet another echo of separation. The medieval soul had sought God above. The modern one found only itself. But the same decade that reached for the stars also reached inward. Civil rights movements, protests, revolutions of thought and music, a generation questioned everything. If the Enlightenment had freed the mind, this era tried to free the heart. Poets, philosophers, and dreamers turned away from power and asked once more, what does it mean to be human? Meanwhile, science raced ahead. DNA revealed the code of life. Computers, once the size of rooms, began to shrink, humming with silent intelligence. The world was now connected by circuits, not caravans. The Library of Alexandria, once lost to flame, was reborn as data flowing through invisible networks. Humanity had built a new cathedral, not of stone, but of information. The 20th century became a paradox, the age of greatest knowledge and deepest loneliness. Billions could speak across the globe, yet understanding felt further away than ever. Empires crumbled, borders shifted, ideologies fell, and still, people searched for something older than all of it: meaning. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it seemed that a new dawn had come. Freedom swept through nations like a long-delayed sunrise. But freedom, like light, casts shadows. The wars of the past gave way to new battles of identity, technology, and truth itself. The world entered the digital age, where every voice could be heard, and yet the noise drowned out the song. As the 21st century began, humanity stood surrounded by miracles it barely understood. Machines could think, images could travel faster than thought, A person could reach across oceans with a touch, yet the same technologies that connected also divided. The internet became both library and labyrinth, a place where wisdom and madness coexisted, where facts and faith once again clashed like medieval crusaders reborn in code. The new world was not built of castles and fields, but of networks and screens. The serfs were gone, but the algorithms ruled. The lords of this age were unseen. Corporations, data, invisible systems shaping every choice. In a strange way, the digital age was not so different from the feudal one. A few owned the land, and the many lived upon it, trading their labor and their time for the illusion of freedom. Yet still, the spirit of the old world lingered. Cathedrals still stood, art still spoke, the stars still shone, as they had for every peasant, painter, philosopher, and astronaut before. And in moments of silence, away from the hum of machines, the same ancient questions whispered through the heart. Who are we? Why are we here? What do we believe? In laboratories, scientists peered deeper into matter and found mystery once again. Quantum mechanics revealed a universe more uncertain than faith had ever imagined. In telescopes orbiting distant planets, astronomers saw echoes of creation older than time. The more we knew, the more we realized how little we understood. The 21st century's miracles became its mirrors. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, virtual worlds. Each promised perfection, and yet each reflected the same flaws that haunted humanity since the Middle Ages. Pride, fear, hope, wonder. We had conquered nature, rewritten life, touched the stars, and still, we longed for meaning. In the quiet of a sleepless night, a man in a skyscraper looked down at the glittering vanes of city lights and felt what a farmer once felt staring at the stars, awe and loneliness, side by side. A child in a distant village held a smartphone and gazed at images from worlds away, as a monk once gazed at stained glass, dreaming of heaven. The tools had changed, the hunger had not. History, it seemed, was not a line, but a circle, a slow, endless turning of light and shadow. The medieval soul believed in divine order. The modern soul believed in human order. Both sought the same thing, understanding, belonging, salvation. Now, standing at the edge of the digital and the cosmic, humanity faced the same ancient choice, to destroy or to create, to rule or to wonder, to live for power or for meaning. The future was not written in prophecy or scripture, but in code, lines of logic replacing lines of prayer. Yet the essence was unchanged, the desire to touch eternity, to make sense of the mystery of being alive. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked, the echo of all clocks before it. From the sundials of Rome to the gears of the industrial age, to the processors counting in nanoseconds, time itself seemed to whisper the same truth, that everything passes, but nothing truly ends. And so the story of humanity, from caves to cathedrals, from plagues to planets, came full circle. The world was vast and yet small, powerful and yet fragile. The medieval dream of salvation, the Renaissance dream of beauty, the Enlightenment dream of reason, all were still alive, woven into the strange, luminous fabric of the present. As the night deepened over cities and forests alike, one could almost hear it, the heartbeat of history, steady and eternal. The same heart that once beat in monks and kings, peasants and painters, thinkers and rebels, now pulsed in satellites and circuits. The Middle Ages were over. The future had begun. But the question that had started it all, what is it to be human, still waited, patient as ever, for its answer.